By the summer of 1942, the leadership of Imperial Japan stood in what appeared to be an unassailable position, surveying a Pacific theater reshaped in a matter of months by speed, coordination, and relentless pressure. From December 1941 onward, Japanese forces had advanced with a tempo that stunned every Western Stab, dismantling defensive systems built over decades and exposing how unprepared colonial armies were for a war fought without pauses or second chances. Singapore fell in February, not after a prolonged siege, but through maneuver and psychological shock, shattering the myth of British invincibility in Asia and echoing through Tokyo as confirmation that the strategic balance of the world had shifted. In the Philippines, American and Filipino forces were driven back, isolated and starved into surrender. Burma collapsed under converging attacks. The Dutch East Indies were seized with their vital oil fields intact. Each success reinforced a single conclusion inside the Japanese general staff. The empire had discovered not merely better tactics, but a superior form of warfare rooted in discipline, endurance, and spiritual cohesion. Japanese soldiers trained to endure hunger, disease, and exhaustion without complaint appeared to thrive where Western armies disintegrated once deprived of comfort, logistics, and certainty. Reports emphasized how enemy units surrendered en masse, how command structures broke down under pressure, and how night attacks produced panic rather than resistance. From these observations grew a conviction that Western soldiers, particularly Americans, were psychologically unfit for prolonged land combat in remote hostile environments, dependent on machines and supply chains that could be disrupted and morale that would collapse once isolation set in. This belief shaped operational planning across the Pacific, narrowing the perceived range of enemy capability and filtering intelligence through expectation rather than analysis. When American forces landed on Guadalcanal in August 1942 to seize a half-finished airfield, Tokyo did not see a strategic challenge but an inconvenience, a secondary operation conducted far from decisive theaters and assumed to be temporary. The island was undeveloped, disease-ridden, and distant from Japan's main supply lines, a place where, in Japanese calculations, an enemy lacking spiritual resilience would inevitably falter. What was not yet understood was that the assumptions underpinning this confidence were already obsolete, and that on this remote strip of jungle and coral, the first quiet fracture in Japan's vision of victory was about to open.
What the Japanese command failed to perceive in the summer of 1942 was not hidden behind secrecy or deception, but behind assumptions so deeply rooted that contrary evidence never fully entered the analytical frame. The United States Marine Corps arriving in the Pacific was not an improvised force assembled in haste, but an institution shaped by 2 decades of deliberate preparation for a specific kind of war that Japanese planners believed the Americans could not fight. During the interwar years, Marine officers had studied the problem of amphibious landings in isolation, examining how infantry units behaved once naval gunfire faded and supply lines thinned, and building doctrine around the expectation that small units would be forced to survive, maneuver, and kill without constant guidance. Training emphasized individual rifle proficiency to a degree uncommon in most armies, with Marines expected to place accurate fire under stress, in poor visibility, and at distances that contradicted Japanese assumptions about jungle combat. Equally important was the cultivation of non-commissioned officers who were trained to assume command instinctively when officers fell, ensuring that cohesion survived chaos rather than collapsing under it. Before the war, Marine units conducted repeated amphibious exercises that exposed them to confusion, exhaustion, and the friction of landing under uncertain conditions, creating a culture that treated disorder as a constant rather than an exception. This training was reinforced by a doctrine that prioritized defensive preparation once ashore, the rapid construction of fighting positions, and the integration of machine guns, mortars, and artillery into a single system designed to deny momentum to an attacker. To Japanese intelligence officers, accustomed to measuring effectiveness through offensive spirit and shock action, these qualities were largely invisible, dismissed as technical refinements incapable of compensating for what they perceived as a lack of moral strength. Yet in the jungle environment of Guadalcanal, where visibility collapsed, night erased formations, and supply shortages punished every mistake, these differences became decisive. Marines fought as if isolation were expected, as if night attacks were inevitable, and as if survival depended less on courage in the charge than on patience, fire discipline, and coordination in the dark. The gap between Japanese expectations and American reality widened quietly during these early weeks, setting the stage for the moment when belief would be tested not by theory but by contact at close range, where assumptions could no longer protect those who held them.
In the early hours of August 21, 1942, under heavy humidity and broken moonlight east of Henderson Field, Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki committed his detachment to an attack that was meant to be decisive, swift, and annihilating. The Japanese force advancing toward the Ilu River, misidentified in reports as the Tenaru, operated under assumptions formed long before the first shot was fired. Ichiki believed he faced a thin, demoralized enemy perimeter, manned by troops unprepared for a determined night assault, and his plan reflected established doctrine: frontal penetration, relentless forward momentum, and the expectation that moral shock would fracture resistance before organized defense could coalesce. His men crossed the sandbar and river mouth in tight formations, bayonets fixed, confident that speed and aggression would carry them through before American fire could fully develop. What followed unfolded not as a chaotic clash, but as a controlled demonstration of a defensive system functioning exactly as intended. Marine units of the 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, had spent days preparing their positions, establishing overlapping fields of fire, and registering artillery and mortar concentrations along likely avenues of approach. When the Japanese advance emerged from darkness, Marines held their fire until targets entered optimal range, then unleashed a volume of rifle, machine gun, and artillery fire that transformed the open ground into a killing zone. The density of fire was not accidental but deliberate, sustained by disciplined ammunition control and coordination between infantry and supporting weapons. Japanese attempts to press forward collapsed under this concentrated fire, yet the assault continued in fragmented waves, each driven by the same belief that persistence would break the defense. By dawn, Marine units counterattacked with infantry and light armor, encircling surviving Japanese soldiers and eliminating organized resistance. From a military perspective, the engagement exposed fatal miscalculations, intelligence failures, rigid adherence to offensive doctrine, and an inability to adapt once surprise had been lost. For Japanese command channels, reports from the Tenaru were deeply unsettling, yet they were filtered through a reluctance to accept that the defeat reflected systemic weakness rather than local error. The result was not immediate reform, but denial, as the first clear evidence that American infantry could absorb and destroy a full-scale night assault was recorded, reviewed, and quietly resisted, even as the implications continued to spread beyond the riverbank where the myth had first been tested and found wanting. In mid-September 1942, the focus of the ground war on Guadalcanal narrowed to a low, uneven ridge south of Henderson Field, a stretch of broken coral and scrub that controlled the southern approaches to the airfield and, by extension, the entire American position on the island. For the Japanese command, this terrain offered the last opportunity to reverse the campaign through decisive night action, and the plan reflected both urgency and conviction.
Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi committed his forces to a series of coordinated nocturnal assaults intended to overwhelm the defenders through infiltration, close combat, and relentless pressure, a final application of the belief that spirit and sacrifice could compensate for material and tactical imbalance. Opposing them were Marine Raider units under Lieutenant Colonel Merritt A. Edson, supported by elements of the 5th Marines, holding positions that were thin, improvised, and exposed, yet anchored by an understanding of terrain and fire discipline forged in the weeks since the landing. As darkness settled on September 12 and 13, Japanese troops moved forward through ravines and jungle, often losing cohesion before contact was made, while Marine defenders struggled to maintain command and control in near-total darkness, punctuated by muzzle flashes and flares. The fighting devolved into fragmented engagements, with positions overrun and retaken repeatedly, yet the critical factor remained altitude, as Marines withdrew methodically up the ridge, consolidating their defense rather than breaking under pressure. Artillery fire, called in at dangerously close distances, shattered attacking formations and illuminated movement, stripping Japanese assaults of surprise and forcing them into costly frontal advances. Leadership at small unit level proved decisive, as non-commissioned officers repositioned squads, redistributed ammunition, and maintained firing lines even when formal command structures faltered. By dawn, the ridge remained in Marine hands, Henderson Field intact, and the Japanese attack spent. Militarily, the engagement demonstrated that night assaults alone could not overcome a defense that combined terrain awareness, coordinated fire support, and adaptive leadership. Psychologically, it marked a deeper rupture, as Japanese units fought with unquestioned courage yet achieved no breakthrough, confronting the reality that moral force did not guarantee tactical success. For the defenders, the ridge became proof that American infantry could endure sustained night combat without collapse, while for the attackers, it raised an unspoken question that lingered beyond the battlefield. If spirit failed here, under ideal conditions for its use, where would it prevail?
The evacuation of Japanese forces from Guadalcanal in February 1943 marked more than the end of a campaign. It forced a quiet but profound reassessment within the Imperial Japanese Army that could no longer be postponed or explained away. For the first time since the opening of the war, a sustained land operation had ended not in withdrawal by the enemy, but in Japan's own deliberate abandonment of the battlefield under pressure it could not relieve. The conclusions drawn in Tokyo and at field headquarters were reluctant, fragmented, and often contested, yet they converged on a single reality. The methods that had delivered victory in 1941 and early 1942 were no longer sufficient against American ground forces. Guadalcanal demonstrated that frontal attacks, night infiltration, and the calculated use of shock could inflict casualties but not decisive results when faced with disciplined infantry supported by integrated firepower and a logistics system capable of sustaining prolonged combat. In the months that followed, this realization reshaped Japanese defensive planning across the Central and Western Pacific, not as an intellectual evolution, but as a forced adaptation born of necessity. On Tarawa in November 1943, Japanese commanders abandoned the expectation that landing forces could be destroyed at the waterline through counterattack, instead constructing mutually supporting bunkers designed to delay and bleed the attacker at every step. The result was catastrophic losses for the garrison, yet even in defeat, the pattern revealed a shift away from mobile offense toward static resistance. This transformation became more pronounced at Peleliu in 1944, where General Sade Inoue's defensive system relied on depth, concealment, and endurance rather than decisive engagement, seeking to prolong the battle rather than win it outright. These changes reflected an acceptance that American infantry could not be broken quickly and that attrition, however costly, was the only remaining strategic tool.
Crucially, this doctrinal shift did not represent a new confidence, but the erosion of an old one. Japanese forces no longer fought with the expectation of overturning the battlefield through spirit alone, but with the understanding that survival and delay were the maximum achievable outcomes. Guadalcanal had imposed this lesson through repeated failure, and each subsequent island merely reinforced it as defenses grew deeper, battles longer, and the original vision of swift, decisive victory receded further into memory, replaced by a grim calculus shaped by the knowledge that the enemy would not withdraw, would not panic, and would not stop advancing.
Guadalcanal emerged in retrospect not as an isolated American success, but as the moment when the structure of the Pacific Land War was irreversibly altered, exposing limits the Japanese strategy could neither ignore nor overcome. For the first time, imperial forces confronted an opponent whose cohesion did not depend on rapid victory, whose morale did not collapse under isolation, and whose command system absorbed casualties without losing operational effectiveness. The Americans on Guadalcanal endured disease, shortages, exhaustion, and repeated night attacks, yet the expected psychological breaking point never arrived. Instead, the campaign revealed a pattern that would define the remainder of the war. American units absorbed punishment, adapted tactically, and continued advancing, even when progress was slow and losses severe. This reality dismantled the foundational assumption that had underpinned Japan's early victories, the belief that moral superiority could substitute for material imbalance and doctrinal rigidity. From a military perspective, Guadalcanal marked the first sustained demonstration that Japanese land forces could be contained, fixed, and defeated through attrition without requiring a decisive maneuver or catastrophic collapse. The inability to dislodge the Marines from Henderson Field despite repeated offensives showed that air power, logistics, and infantry were now inseparable components of American strength, forming a system that regenerated faster than Japanese forces could disrupt it. Once this system was established, the initiative passed permanently to the Allies, not through a single breakthrough, but through the accumulation of pressure that Japan lacked the industrial and logistical depth to match. Subsequent battles on Iwo Jima and Okinawa would be fought with greater ferocity and preparation, yet they followed a logic first revealed on Guadalcanal, where Japanese defenders no longer sought victory in the traditional sense, but delay, exhaustion, and symbolic resistance. Psychologically, the campaign ended the war Japan believed it was fighting and replaced it with one it could only endure. The enemy could not be frightened away by night assaults, could not be compelled to withdraw through casualties alone, and could not be denied the ability to return stronger after each engagement. Guadalcanal forced this recognition not through theory, but through months of unrelenting combat that left no room for reinterpretation. Every later island battle unfolded in its shadow, shaped by lessons learned too late to change the outcome. What began there was not merely a shift in momentum, but the collapse of illusion itself, as the Pacific War entered a final phase where determination met capacity, and only one side possessed both.